The abuse of power inside an HOA rarely begins with shouting or open threats. It starts quietly, hidden behind bylaws, procedures, and the illusion of community standards. Authority is framed as responsibility, but in the wrong hands it becomes leverage. Fines are issued not to maintain order, but to apply pressure. Notices are sent not to inform, but to intimidate. Rules are interpreted selectively, enforced unevenly, and weaponized against anyone who doesn't fit the unspoken hierarchy of the neighborhood. What should be a neutral system for shared living becomes a private tool for control. In many cases, the targets are chosen carefully. New residents, people living alone, anyone perceived as lacking allies. The HOA board understands optics, so the abuse is rarely obvious. It hides behind concerns, violations, and anonymous complaints. A flower pot placed 2 inches too far from the curb. A trash bin left out 15 minutes past the allowed time. A noise complaint that no one else heard. Each action alone seems trivial, but together they form a pattern designed to exhaust, isolate, and dominate. Intimidation escalates when resistance appears. If the target questions a fine, more citations follow. If they attend a meeting, they're talked over, dismissed, or mocked under the guise of procedure. Motions are rushed through. Minutes are rewritten. The board presents itself as unanimous, even when it isn't. Power thrives on the appearance of inevitability, and HOAs often exploit that by making opposition feel futile. The message is clear without being spoken. Comply, or life here will become very difficult. What makes HOA abuse particularly insidious is how personal it becomes while pretending to be impersonal. Board members may live just a few houses away, smiling during the day while filing complaints at night. They learn schedules, habits, vulnerabilities. They know when someone is home alone, when guests visit, when lights turn off. The proximity blurs boundaries, turning governance into surveillance. The victim doesn't just feel watched by an institution, but by neighbors who should have been neutral or supportive. Fear is a common byproduct. Not dramatic fear, but the low-grade, constant tension of knowing another letter could arrive at any time. That tension affects sleep, work, and mental health. Some people move away not because they broke rules, but because fighting feels too costly. HOAs rely on this attrition. They don't need to win arguments if they can outlast the person raising them. Silence becomes compliance, and compliance reinforces their authority. Power abuse also feeds on social narratives. The board casts itself as the protector of property values and community morals, subtly framing the target as disruptive or problematic. Rumors circulate. Side conversations happen near mailboxes and driveways. The victim becomes that person, defined not by who they are, but by how the HOA describes them. This social pressure amplifies the official pressure, making it harder to find allies willing to speak up. What often goes unnoticed is how calculated this behavior is. It's not chaos, it's strategy. Every warning letter, every selective enforcement, every procedural delay is designed to maintain dominance while avoiding accountability. The rules are thick, confusing, and constantly changing, which allows those in charge to claim ignorance or technical correctness when challenged. Abuse hides in complexity, because complexity discourages scrutiny. HOA power abuse thrives in environments where people assume systems are fair by default. Many residents don't question authority until it affects them directly. By then, the structure is already entrenched. Meetings are controlled. Committees are stacked. Legal counsel is aligned with the board. The individual faces an organization with money, time, and perceived legitimacy on its side. Yet the most dangerous aspect of HOA abuse is the confidence it creates in those wielding it. Over time, they stop seeing themselves as enforcers of rules and start seeing themselves as untouchable. They mistake compliance for respect, silence for agreement, and fear for loyalty. That overconfidence leads them to push further, to test boundaries, to assume no one will push back effectively, especially not someone they've already labeled as weak or isolated. Especially not when the intimidation has worked so well for so long. Especially not when they believe the system itself will always protect them regardless of how far they go. Objectification begins with perception, not action. It starts when a person is reduced to a single trait and stripped of complexity, autonomy, and agency. In this case, attraction was never just attraction. It became entitlement disguised as admiration, desire twisted into justification. When someone is labeled instead of understood, it becomes easier for others to believe they have a claim over them. Words shape behavior, and once the language turns dehumanizing, the next steps feel permissible to those who benefit from it. Calling someone a name, especially one meant to sexualize, is not casual behavior. It is a deliberate act of framing. It places the individual into a role written by someone else, one where boundaries are optional and consent is assumed or ignored. The label becomes a shortcut that erases context, profession, intelligence, independence, history. Once that reduction happens, control no longer feels like control to the aggressor. It feels like taking what was already framed as available. Objectification thrives in environments where power exists, even if that power is mundane or bureaucratic. The HOA structure provided a stage where authority could be subtly merged with desire. Rules became excuses for contact. Notices became reasons to show up. Inspections became opportunities to invade space under the protection of policy. When desire hides behind authority, it gains cover. The aggressor convinces himself he is acting within his rights, even as he crosses lines that would be obvious in any other context. What makes objectification dangerous is how it distorts responsibility. The focus shifts away from the behavior of those exerting pressure and toward the existence of the person being targeted. Her presence becomes the problem. Her appearance becomes the provocation. Her refusal becomes disrespect. This inversion allows those seeking control to see themselves as reactive rather than predatory. In their minds, they are responding to temptation, not creating harm. The social reinforcement of this mindset is subtle but powerful. Smirks exchanged during meetings. Comments framed as jokes. Shared assumptions that go unchallenged. When multiple people participate in the same objectifying narrative, it gains legitimacy. The group normalizes the behavior, not by openly agreeing on actions, but by agreeing on the story they tell themselves about who she is and what she represents. Once the story is fixed, actions feel justified. Control enters the picture when objectification meets resistance. A person who is supposed to be passive, receptive, or flattered but instead asserts boundaries disrupts the narrative. That disruption is often met with hostility. The objectifier feels denied something he believes he was owed. What could have remained internal resentment turns outward, seeking leverage. Control becomes a way to reassert dominance, to punish noncompliance, to force the story back into alignment with expectations. This is where desire fully mutates into coercion. Fines, warnings, and threats become tools not of governance, but of retaliation. The goal is no longer attraction, but submission. Each action is meant to remind the target of her vulnerability, to signal that resistance has consequences. The irony is that the more control is pursued, the clearer it becomes that attraction was never the real driver. Power was. Objectification also relies on the false belief that visibility equals availability. Being seen is interpreted as an invitation. Living confidently, moving freely, existing without apology is reframed as provocation. This belief absolves the aggressor of self-restraint while burdening the target with responsibility for managing others' behavior. The standard becomes impossible. Exist, but not too visibly. Be attractive, but not aware of it. Be friendly, but not assertive. When objectification is paired with authority, the imbalance deepens. The target is forced to navigate not just unwanted attention, but institutional pressure. Complaints cannot be dismissed easily. Appeals require time, money, and emotional energy. The aggressors rely on this imbalance, knowing the system favors those already in control. They mistake this advantage for proof that they are right, that the system itself validates their behavior. Over time, this mindset becomes self-reinforcing. Each unchallenged action strengthens the belief that control is deserved. Each moment of silence is interpreted as acceptance. Each small victory emboldens the next move. What began as a thought becomes a pattern, than a strategy. The humanity of the person being targeted fades further, replaced entirely by the role assigned to her in their minds, a role that exists solely to satisfy their expectations and justify their actions, a role they cling to even as reality contradicts it again and again. Escalation rarely announces itself. It develops in increments so small they can be rationalized away, especially when it happens out of sight. What begins as a rule enforced a little too strictly becomes a pattern of selective attention. A comment made quietly becomes a habit of observation. The private spaces between official actions are where intent sharpens, because there is no audience there, no immediate accountability. Behind closed doors, behavior is guided less by policy and more by impulse. The early stages often look administrative. Emails sent late at night, wording that feels personal but is framed as procedural, decisions made without discussion and justified afterward. These actions don't attract notice because they resemble normal operations. That resemblance is intentional. It provides cover. Escalation hides inside routine, relying on the assumption that systems are neutral and that those operating them are acting in good faith. As attention narrows onto a single individual, the frequency of contact increases. Inspections become more frequent. Violations become more creative. The same rule is suddenly interpreted differently depending on who it's applied to. Each interaction is small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they form a steady pressure. The target senses it before they can prove it. Intuition recognizes patterns long before documentation catches up. Behind closed doors, conversations change tone. Language becomes less formal, more revealing. Frustration is expressed openly. The individual is discussed not as a resident, but as a problem to be managed. This shift matters because it reframes actions. When someone is no longer seen as a person with rights, but as an obstacle, escalation feels justified. Solutions become more aggressive. Restraint feels unnecessary. Coordination begins subtly. One person mentions an issue to another. Complaints are encouraged. Stories are shared and exaggerated. What was once a single perspective becomes a shared narrative. This collective agreement amplifies confidence. When multiple people validate each other's perceptions, doubt disappears. The group convinces itself it is responding to a threat rather than creating one. The absence of transparency accelerates this process. Decisions made outside meetings avoid scrutiny. Documentation becomes selective. Emails go unanswered while actions continue. The target is kept reacting, always a step behind. Appeals take time, and time is used strategically. Delays exhaust energy. Silence becomes a tactic. Escalation doesn't need confrontation if it can achieve compliance through fatigue. What's happening behind closed doors is not just administrative maneuvering, but psychological conditioning. Each action tests boundaries. If there is no pushback, the next step goes further. If there is resistance, pressure increases. The goal is to establish dominance without triggering a response strong enough to attract oversight. It's a balancing act, and those escalating believe they are skilled at it. Privacy also allows fantasy to influence behavior. Without external checks, assumptions harden into beliefs. Motives are assigned. Intent is projected. The individual being targeted becomes a character in a story told repeatedly in private. That story justifies escalation. Facts become secondary to narrative consistency. Anything that contradicts the story is dismissed or reinterpreted. The danger of closed-door escalation is that it feeds on itself. Each step creates justification for the next. Increased scrutiny leads to more findings, which are used to validate the scrutiny. It becomes a loop. From the outside, it may look like enforcement. From the inside, it feels like momentum. Stopping feels harder than continuing, because stopping would require admitting the earlier steps were unnecessary or wrong. This process is often invisible to bystanders. Neighbors see the results, but not the cause. They hear about violations, but not the context. They assume fairness because the system appears intact. The real activity remains hidden, protected by process and proximity. Escalation thrives in that gap between perception and reality. As pressure builds, the actions behind closed doors become bolder. Language hardens. Patience thins. The belief that the target will eventually break becomes an expectation. When that doesn't happen, frustration grows. Frustration fuels risk-taking. Rules are bent more obviously. Lines are crossed with the assumption that nothing will come of it. The people escalating often believe they are still in control. They mistake secrecy for safety. They believe that as long as actions remain fragmented and undocumented in one place, consequences can be avoided. This belief encourages continuation. It blinds them to the possibility that patterns can be seen from the outside once someone knows where to look, once someone has the discipline to observe quietly, once someone understands how systems are manipulated and how pressure accumulates. Once someone recognizes that what happens behind closed doors leaves traces in timing, tone, and repetition, traces that can be mapped, correlated, and exposed in ways the escalators never anticipated. Underestimation begins with assumption. It forms when people decide they already understand the limits of someone else without ever testing them. In this case, the assumption was built on appearances and roles. A quiet presence, a low profile, someone who didn't attend meetings, didn't argue loudly, didn't posture. To those accustomed to dominance through bureaucracy and numbers, silence looked like weakness and distance looked like disengagement. They evaluated the situation using the wrong metrics. They measured power in titles, committees, and procedural leverage. They believed influence came from being visible and vocal, from stacking votes and controlling agendas. They didn't consider the possibility that real power often operates invisibly, patiently, and with restraint. The protector was not part of their social ecosystem, which made him easy to dismiss. Familiarity breeds complacency. The board and its allies were used to winning through attrition. They had seen people fold, move away, or comply after enough pressure. That history shaped their confidence. Every previous success reinforced the belief that their methods were universally effective. They stopped imagining alternatives. When patterns repeat without consequence, imagination shrinks. The protector's absence from conflict was interpreted as ignorance. They assumed he didn't understand how the system worked, didn't know the rules, didn't grasp the implications. This misjudgment was critical. They believed knowledge only flowed one way, from authority to subject. They failed to consider that someone trained to assess threats would be watching, not reacting, absorbing information rather than broadcasting intent. Underestimation also came from stereotyping. They expected emotional responses where there were none. They anticipated confrontation, outrage, or desperation. When those reactions didn't appear, they assumed victory was inevitable. Calm was mistaken for resignation. Control relies on predictability, and they thought they had it. What they didn't see was discipline, the kind that resists impulse, the kind that understands timing. The protector didn't rush to intervene because rushing reveals strategy. He observed how pressure was applied, how rules were bent, who initiated actions, and who followed. Each incident added data. Each escalation revealed more about the structure and the individuals driving it. Their arrogance prevented them from recognizing the shift. They continued as before, confident that the imbalance favored them. That confidence dulled caution. Actions became sloppier. Language grew less guarded. Procedures were followed less carefully. The sense of invulnerability encouraged shortcuts. Underestimation breeds carelessness. The protector's background mattered not because of physical capability, but because of mindset. Threat assessment is not about reacting to single events. It's about identifying patterns, motivations, and vulnerabilities. He understood that systems fail at their weakest points, and that people reveal those points when they believe no one is watching. The more they underestimated him, the more freely they exposed themselves. They assumed protection meant confrontation. They expected a dramatic intervention, a heated exchange, something obvious they could dismiss or escalate against. When none came, they relaxed. They didn't realize that protection can also mean preparation, that it can mean ensuring that when action is taken, it is decisive, legitimate, and impossible to ignore. Their miscalculation was rooted in ego. They believed their authority was inherent rather than situational. They confused their roles with their identities. Anyone outside that structure was seen as irrelevant. This belief blinded them to the idea that someone could operate independently of their system while still understanding it better than they did. Underestimation creates a false sense of security. It convinces people that outcomes are fixed. That belief discourages self-examination. Why question behavior if you assume there will be no consequences? Why refine tactics if you believe the opponent is incapable? This mindset invites exposure. The protector allowed this process to continue because stopping it too early would have preserved their illusions. Each additional action they took deepened the record. Each step reinforced the pattern. By the time they realized they were not alone, that someone had been paying attention with intent, the narrative they had constructed no longer protected them. They had mistaken restraint for inability, silence for ignorance, distance for indifference. They never considered that the person they dismissed had spent years learning how organizations collapse from the inside, how authority overreaches, how arrogance leaves trails. They underestimated not just a man, but a method, one that doesn't announce itself, one that waits until confidence turns into exposure, one that relies on the certainty that people who believe they are untouchable will eventually prove otherwise. Precision justice is not loud, impulsive, or chaotic. It is calculated, restrained, and rooted in an understanding of systems rather than emotion. The goal is not retaliation but correction, not spectacle but outcome. Acting within the rules while exposing those who abuse them requires discipline, because the instinct to confront directly often undermines legitimacy. True precision means knowing exactly where pressure belongs and applying it without leaving room for deflection or denial. The first step is restraint. Not reacting immediately denies aggressors the confirmation they expect. They rely on emotional responses to validate their narratives and justify escalation. By remaining controlled, the balance shifts. Every interaction becomes a data point instead of a confrontation. Dates, times, wording, inconsistencies, and deviations from procedure are noted quietly. Precision justice begins with observation, because evidence is the foundation that cannot be argued away. Understanding the rules is critical. Systems that are abused are also systems that can be audited. Bylaws, state statutes, procedural requirements, and fiduciary duties exist whether they are respected or not. Those who misuse authority often assume others are unfamiliar with these details. They depend on confusion and intimidation. Precision justice reverses that dynamic by mastering the same framework that was used to apply pressure. Knowledge becomes leverage. Documentation transforms isolated incidents into patterns. A single fine can be dismissed as an error. Repeated fines with inconsistent reasoning reveal intent. Selective enforcement becomes visible when compared across cases. Emails that seem routine expose tone and bias when read together. Precision justice is cumulative. Each small piece on its own may appear insignificant, but together they form a structure that tells a clear story. The key is timing. Acting too early allows aggressors to adjust and conceal. Acting too late risks unnecessary harm. Precision requires waiting until the record is complete enough that outcomes are unavoidable. This patience is often misunderstood by those who equate justice with speed. In reality, systems respond to weight, not urgency. When the evidence is sufficient, response becomes automatic rather than discretionary. Precision justice also avoids unnecessary exposure. Not every action needs to be public. Some interventions are more effective when directed at the correct authority quietly. Regulatory bodies, ombudsmen, insurers, and legal counsel respond to clear violations of duty. These channels operate independently of local power structures. When they are engaged properly, the conversation shifts from personal dispute to institutional risk. One of the most effective aspects of precision justice is that it forces accountability without theatrics. There is no shouting match to discredit, no threat to reframe as hostility. The focus remains on compliance, policy, and liability. Those who relied on intimidation find themselves constrained by the very rules they weaponized. Their language changes. Their confidence fades. Procedures they once ignored suddenly matter. Acting within the rules denies aggressors their preferred defense. They cannot claim harassment when the process is followed correctly. They cannot claim bias when comparisons are documented. They cannot dismiss concerns as emotional when everything is factual. Precision justice removes ambiguity. It narrows the conversation until only the truth remains. Another advantage of this approach is that it protects the target from retaliation. Because actions are legitimate and verifiable, attempts to escalate backfire. Each retaliatory move adds to the record. Each deviation increases exposure. Precision justice turns aggression into liability. The more those in power resist, the more they implicate themselves. This method also preserves dignity. It does not require becoming what one is opposing. There is no need to intimidate, threaten, or humiliate. The system corrects itself when confronted with undeniable evidence. The outcome is not personal defeat, but institutional correction. Positions change. Authority shifts. Behavior adjusts. Precision justice is often invisible until it isn't. To outsiders, the shift appears sudden. A board member resigns. Policies are reviewed. Enforcement patterns change. What they don't see is the accumulation that made those outcomes inevitable. This invisibility is intentional. It prevents interference and protects integrity. Those who abuse power underestimate this approach because it lacks drama. They mistake calm for compliance and silence for surrender. They do not realize that restraint is strategic, that adherence to rules can be more disruptive than defiance, that justice delivered precisely leaves no room for reinterpretation. In the end, the most effective form of justice is the one that cannot be argued with, not because it is overwhelming, but because it is exact. It speaks in their language, uses their mechanisms, and exposes their contradictions. It doesn't break rules because breaking rules would weaken it. It relies on the certainty that systems, when confronted with clear evidence of abuse, must respond, and that those who believe themselves untouchable will be forced to answer within the same structure they once controlled. Arrogance thrives on the belief that consequences are for other people. It grows slowly, reinforced by small victories and unchecked behavior. Each time authority is exercised without challenge, confidence hardens into entitlement. Rules stop feeling like obligations and start feeling like tools. Oversight is treated as a formality. The assumption takes hold that status alone is protection. That position insulates behavior from scrutiny. Within that mindset, accountability feels abstract. It exists in theory, but not in practice. Warnings are ignored because nothing happened last time. Procedures are bypassed because no one complained before. Arrogance reframes risk as inconvenience. Those who benefit from the system convince themselves they are the system, and that distinction is where collapse begins. The first cracks appear when confidence turns into predictability. Arrogant actors repeat patterns because repetition has worked. They stop adapting. They reuse language, tactics, and justifications. What once felt clever becomes routine. This repetition leaves trails. The very consistency that made their actions efficient makes them visible when examined closely. Accountability does not arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It emerges as pressure from multiple directions, each grounded in documentation and process. Insurance questions arise. Legal language enters conversations. External reviews are mentioned. Suddenly, decisions that were once casual require explanation. Arrogance is unprepared for this shift because it never planned for scrutiny. It planned for obedience. As accountability approaches, behavior changes. Tone becomes cautious. Meetings become shorter. Communication moves to formal channels. The same people who once dismissed concerns now emphasize policy and compliance. This shift is not growth, it is fear. Fear exposes what arrogance tried to hide. It reveals that authority was never as secure as it appeared. One of the most destabilizing aspects of accountability is that it reframes the narrative. Actions once described as enforcement are reclassified as overreach. Decisions once defended as discretion are evaluated as violations of duty. Intent becomes irrelevant. Impact takes precedence. Arrogance depends on controlling the story, and accountability removes that control. When records are reviewed, context disappears. There are no justifications, only actions and timelines. Emails speak for themselves. Patterns emerge without commentary. What felt reasonable in isolation looks deliberate in sequence. Accountability is indifferent to ego. It does not care how someone sees themselves, only what they did and whether it aligns with obligation. Those who relied on intimidation often attempt to reclaim control when accountability looms. They deflect. They blame. They question motives. These tactics fail because accountability is not personal. It is procedural. It does not argue. It evaluates. Each attempt to evade responsibility adds friction, and friction draws attention. Arrogance also collapses because it isolates. Those who acted boldly when they felt protected find themselves alone when protection weakens. Allies distance themselves. Silence replaces support. No one wants to share liability. The collective confidence that once reinforced behavior evaporates, leaving individuals exposed. Accountability narrows focus, and narrowing focus reveals who made decisions and who benefited from them. The psychological impact is significant. People who believe they were untouchable struggle to adjust to limits. They misinterpret accountability as betrayal or persecution. This misinterpretation deepens the collapse because it prevents adaptation. Instead of correcting course, they resist, and resistance accelerates consequences. Accountability is relentless in its simplicity. It asks basic questions and expects complete answers. Who authorized this? Under what provision? Where is the documentation? Why was this treated differently? These questions dismantle arrogance because arrogance is rarely prepared to explain itself clearly. It relied on assumption, not justification. As consequences materialize, authority is redefined. Titles lose weight. Procedures gain importance. The structure that once shielded behavior now constrains it. This reversal is jarring for those accustomed to dominance. They experience the system not as a weapon, but as a boundary. That experience is the collapse. What remains after arrogance falls is exposure. Not humiliation, but clarity. Roles are reassessed. Power is redistributed. Oversight increases. The environment changes not because someone was defeated, but because the system corrected itself under pressure. Accountability does not seek revenge. It enforces alignment. Those watching from the outside often perceive this shift as sudden. They see resignations, policy changes, and formal statements. They do not see the gradual erosion that made those outcomes unavoidable. Arrogance collapses quietly before it collapses visibly, weakened by its own excess, undone by the belief that it would never have to answer to anyone, and proven wrong the moment accountability stopped being theoretical and became unavoidable reality grounded in records, obligations. And the simple fact that power without restraint eventually exposes itself through the very actions it once believed were beyond question.